So on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the Dr. Annette Yoshiko Reed's as the Etta and Milton Leve Scholar in Residence for this year. So today Dr. Reed will speak on Ancient Judaism between Christian memory and Jewish forgetting. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to thank the generous departments and centers on and off campus for acting as co-sponsors for this event. They include the UCLA Center for the Study of Religion, the UCLA Department of History, the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and the UCLA Department of Classics. And this is in addition to the Jewish Studies program at Loyola Marymount University. We hope you can join us at many more Leve Center events this year. You can find more information on these upcoming events at the registration table near the entrance of the room and online as well. I'd also like to thank the Leve Center staff for making the arrangements for today's and this week's events, and especially Chelsea in particular, who's in the back. So thank you, Chelsea, for all your work on this. And while we're doing that, I also would like to remind everyone to please take this time to silence your phones so that we are not interrupted with buzzing and dings. So, to introduce my colleague now. Annette Yoshiko Reed is the professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Harvard University School, or Harvard Divinity School, excuse me. She studies ancient Jews and Christians.
Setting a good example.
Yeah. Now I can start over. It's perfect. So she is the professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Harvard Divinity School. She studies ancient Jews and Christians with a focus on questions of knowledge, identity, and difference. Her recent books include Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism and Christianity, as well as, and I brought it here, Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism, published in 2020 with Cambridge University Press. She's currently working on a book on the cultural power of forgetting, focusing on the Jewish reception of the Second Temple past, which she will be speaking with us about today and Thursday. So drawing on her in-progress book on forgetting, her seminar today will explore the place of memory and forgetting in the reception of Second Temple Judaism, revisiting the supposed rabbinic retreat from history after the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and exploring Christian and Jewish contestation over pre-70 Jewish pasts from antiquity to the present. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Reed, and we look forward to the seminar today.
No, thank you so much, and I'm very delighted to be here. It's an honor to be here, and also I'm really kind of going to take the opportunity of the seminar to kind of informally work out some ideas. I put up a handout, but the handout is kind of sources to talk to and with, so I won't go through all these intense sources, but also I have them here in part so that if we want to talk more about one area or the other, we're happy to do so. So one of the reason I would like to thank Kate, thank Chelsea especially for all the work she's done, and all the various sponsors of this event. And I'm very happy to be able to be here and kind of stay for a while, even if just a week, to kind of get a sense of the place, be in conversation with people, and kind of share different parts of what is this kind of in-progress book. It comes with great timing. I mean, I'm pretty much near the end of writing this book. Near the end. So by in progress, I really mean in progress. So everything I'll share both today and also on Thursday, it's the first time I'm presenting it. So it's exciting, but also bear with me. I'm very much using this opportunity, especially to explore material from the last two chapters of the book. So by means of introduction here, I'll talk a little bit, just about the project in general. What I'm trying to do, it's a different kind of project than I often do, and then turn to kind of some of the specifics with regard to one of the chapters that I'm still working through, in the hopes that we can have kind of a conversation about it. So, what do I mean by talking about forgetting? I partially chose this as a topic because it's a topic that I guess I like it as a topic because it seems at first sight to be something that a scholar of antiquity, ancient religions, a scholar of Judaism, and a scholar of Second Temple Judaism should be exactly the opposite of doing. Much of the stuff I work on materials from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so-called pseudepigrapha, so-called apocrypha, Josephus, Philo, Greek Jewish authors preserved by Alexander Polyhistor. The materials we work on when we work on Second Temple Judaism are largely materials that we are able to work on and we have a history of working on because they were in some ways either lost or neglected, and then particularly starting earlier than the 19th century, but particularly in the 19th century, 20th century, and especially with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a kind of recovery. So those of us who work on Second Temple Judaism, and I've had the honor of being able to do so, both in respect to certain positions where I've been, before I was at Harvard, I was at NYU in a Jewish studies position, and then now I'm at Harvard in a New Testament early Christianity position. This is one of the kind of joys of dealing with Second Temple period. But nevertheless, often what we're doing is we're recovering. So I'm often saying, here was, I work often on, for instance, the set of texts that best known from their Ethiopian forms as 1 Enoch. These are texts that were rediscovered, in quotations. But their reintroduction to the West was a kind of key moment in the formation of scholarship in this area, ancient Judaism in general. And then likewise, the rediscovery of Aramaic fragments of them, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the middle of the 20th century, also this kind of notion that we're rediscovering, filling in this new picture. So much of the work I've done throughout my career, on Second Temple Judaism and its reception has been largely really framed in this kind of rhetoric, recovering something, having a sense of we have, whole periods of time. In my last book, talk about whole periods of time that we're able to really fill in terms of Jewish cultural history because we have new evidence. And the expansion of the evidence with Dead Sea Scrolls is a massive expansion of evidence for Second Temple Judaism as well as Hebrew Bible. First-hand evidence that hasn't passed through, Christian traditions, which a lot of our Second Temple materials we have because of, Christian monasteries, Christian scribal cultures, churches outside of the Roman Empire, translations into, Ethiopic in particular, but also, other traditions. But this has been the way part of the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is a kind of massive area of importance. It's something that has been, laborious in terms of people working on the fragments, incredibly important in its own right. This project, I decided to do something different, which is to kind of, say, now that we are able to have a fuller sense of Second Temple Judaism, meaning the period, roughly speaking, when the period between the Babylonian exile and the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70. So basically this kind of intermediate period that isn't covered either by study of, Hebrew Bible, study of rabbinic literature, study of New Testament, that kind of in-between space that people have, tried to find ways to talk about that doesn't describe it as an in-between space. But part of what, my shift, this shift in this project is basically instead of to try to recover and fill in, to ask the opposite question. The more that we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls in particular, as well as from the manuscript discoveries, especially in the 19th century, but even before, the more we also get this sense that actually there was a lot that was lost, that at the very least fell outside of those Jewish traditions that are usually described as the Jewish tradition. Some of it came as a complete surprise. And I think, for me, a lot of the materials that I found very striking dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance, are materials like the Astronomical book, Enochic Astronomical book and related materials. These are things that fell out of the tradition in a way that I don't think we see a trace of it. It's a surprise. The amount of Aramaic literary production before pre-Rabbinic Aramaic literary production, and especially in the Hellenistic period. It's a surprise. We obviously knew there's some of it from Daniel and so forth, but the idea that this was, seems to have been its own tradition, also quite a surprise. So how did this fall out? And that's kind of my present project, which is, I admittedly kind of impossible task, but it's an impossible task that I'm hoping to think with. And it's impossible, I'm thinking with it in kind of two different ways, one of which is to say, as historians, but also especially as those historians who deal with the Jewish tradition within Jewish studies, we have a tendency to really privilege continuity. And there's every reason to do so. There's a kind of cases between censorship of the Talmud, Holocaust denial. There's many reasons why Jewish studies as a discipline is deeply committed to continuity, recovery, and memory. Most famously, within Yosef Yerushalmi's Zachor, this has been kind of a major way that when people talk about Jewish studies across historical time, they talk about. So in that way, talking about the opposite, talking about what's dropped out of the tradition and why, is often just thought of as being, either something you don't talk about directly or you frame as some kind of failure. Or that you frame as a scholarly task that you're supposed to reverse. Like, my job is to reverse this. And I actually do believe my job is to reverse it. But then I also think that we may be missing something at the same time when we don't take seriously that there may be creative processes that are no less part of Jewish cultural history and transmission of traditions that we neglect when we privilege continuity and don't look, for instance, at gaps, erasures, what's left out, what's chosen to be bracketed off, and so forth. Like, we often risk a kind of a presentist history where we say, oh, here's what we have today. Let me find the first instance of it in the past, which is it's something that's very valuable that you can do as a scholar of antiquity. But sometimes you also miss things along the way. There are many kind of cases where we see this, already the mid-20th century, like Gershom Scholem, when he critiques earlier scholarship on history of Judaism, Wissenschaft des Judentum, the kind of origins of Jewish studies as we know it, he critiques for what's not seen, what's cut out in the desire to only speak to our present. What's he calls subterranean streams or so forth. So in part, I take up a similar task, although in quite a different way, of saying within this project, how do we think about that loss, but in a way where we can theorize it. And I do this in interaction with memory studies, but also especially in interaction with those elements of memory studies that have really, critiqued the framing of that which is not remembered as only memory failure. And which is, it's a productive thing in its own right, but one of the things that people think about when they think about individual memory is that, you have forces like you prune memories. And pruning is not negative, pruning is actually positive. You decide, there's certain things that are relegated to forgetting. There are notions of things to which you attend, and decisions about that which you attend, and then decisions about that which you don't attend. And I have this whole kind of thing, if anybody's interested, in terms of thinking about questions about, I use forgetting in the kind of broad metonymical sense that people use the concept of memory when they're talking about culture. But the degree to which you can have productive discontinuity, a production of rupture. Okay, so this is all the kind of big whatever. I want to shift here to kind of one example of this, and this is so throughout my book I look at archival amnesia, the way that collection serves not just to omit, but also to kind of even out what's in between. That's like one of the chapters. I looked at issues of overwriting, this concept of setting the tail, once you have a certain frame in which to see things, it becomes harder to see things that don't fit into that frame. which operates on these various different levels, kind of questions about overriding and selectivity. And then when I get, we'll talk about writing. I'll talk about my writing stuff on Thursday, thinking about the ways in which writtenness is both framed as memory aid and also engine for forgetfulness. That which you can forget. It's kind of like how I don't know anybody's phone number anymore because I have like this, or like I don't know how to get places. But that kind of that element. So I mean, this is just a kind of example of I want to look at these smaller microdynamics. So instead of saying, oh, if something's left out, it must have, it's not worth it must have never been worth keeping. Or if saying something's left out, it must have been suppressed or censored. But thinking of these like as an invitation to look at subtler cultural dynamics that either allow loss, encourage loss, or present loss, especially in a pre-printing press culture. Okay, so the part that I will talk about briefly today that I have this complicated handout about are questions of periodization. And especially in relation to what has been, the one kind of way in which this topic of the forgetting of a Second Temple past has been dealt with in previous scholarship, which is this kind of trope of the idea that in rabbinic literature, post-70 Judaism, like history was forgotten. And the most famous example of this is in Josephus Yerushalmi's Zahor, the most influential one to the present. And he really frames this as, the rabbis after 70 basically, stop writing history. History is forgotten. After Josephus, first century Jewish historian who writes about the period prior, including in, history written in Greek, ostensibly to a Roman audience, covering from creation to his present, with a special focus on the Jewish war, the events that lead to the destruction of the Second Temple. For Yerushalmi makes this kind of famous argument that you have after the loss of Josephus is not just the loss of Josephus, the choice by Jews not to transmit Josephus after 70. And the choice of Christians to transmit it ends up being a kind of a certain kind of parting where you have history on one side and a retreat from history on the other. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this argument, and so the idea is that the past, the rabbinic concept, encounter with the past is through, basically mediated through Torah and Scripture in general, as being a kind of complete object, and through kind of ritual repetition. So more, kind of continued repetitive concern for individual events rather than a concern for a history of their own time or history writing. So this, in my chapter 5, this is the position that I kind of both interrogate and critique. And the kind of the case that part of what's interesting about it, and you see also Brenner's example here. And these are like great historians who are making this point. It's like when they're making the point, they make it in this incredibly dehistoricized fashion. That you have these like beautiful works of historical analysis in which this idea serves to kind of make, if you read Yerushalmi and actually Brenner, but you would never know the Dead Sea Scrolls were ever discovered. You would actually never know that pretty much anything happened in the Second Temple period. You would think that we're talking about like a minute instead of like basically like 600 years. So it's like framed only as something that's important as a, as that point of contrast with what comes after. So my argument, which I could be wrong, and I'm happy to try out, is that part of what's interesting about this is you see this as an example of what I cite at the beginning from the sociologist of knowledge, Evietar Zerubbabel, who's been this kind of real theorist of time and cultural production of time. So meaning we think about temporality, I should say, in a way that's not just like actual, and that part of what that means is that we decide, the moment that the history of us begins. And when I wrote this, I made this hard. When I first started working on this project, I had to make this like really fervent argument that this was a kind of interesting thing to talk about. But then things like the 1619 project are a perfect example. When do we begin this history? And he frames this as it's a productive act of forgetfulness. You mark the beginning of something, you mark the rest as prehistory, like when do we start this story? So within an American context, you can see that this is not a theoretical. I mean, it is a theoretical, but it also has to do with like who is the we to which history speaks in the choice of when we begin. So he's making this concept of this is a kind of forgetting, and I think there's like a way to kind of think about this also in relation to the question of history as that which is lost after 70. It's a story. It's a narrative about the present. So you can go back, kind of, the origins of this, where you go back, within the history of scholarship, goes back to Henrik Gretz, who writes this, first extensive. I mean, he even presents himself as writing the first extensive history of the Jews, framed as history of the Jews, not history of Judaism, and then 19th century Germany, and he depicts his own activity as a historian as the reversal of this. So he has his periodization. He has like a few ancient periodizations, and the periodization that begins at 70 goes to his day. So it's like you have these 300 years, 200 years, and then the next one is like a couple thousand years. So he sees this break. To say that Josephus marks the loss of history is to say that's something that he says is being recovered. And you see in this quote, he compares it to a death and resurrection. Which, to say a death and resurrection for a century, obviously has like an additional force to it. And when you look more closely at the kind of origins of this trope, part of what you see, you have to kind of keep flipping, is he's quite explicit that this is against the Christian historians of his time. He particularly he goes after Hegel and those who are Hegelians. So meaning he really wants to say, if you read like Hegel's philosophy of history, you read along and then basically you have, you would never know that Judaism's history continued after Christianity. So you have these twin periodizations, each of which decides says they're deciding what to remember while also deciding like what can you forget. So within these histories, the Christian histories of Judaism, there is no post-Christian Judaism. Sometimes Judaism is even quite literally compared to a mummy or kind of like a zombie nation, a nation that has no life after, like all that it contributed to history was leading up to Christianity, after which it stops. And in the 19th century materials, like I'm actually not exaggerating, that these are ways of partitioning knowledge that end up becoming naturalized. If we were to make a list of Jewish studies courses in America, a lot of times you have lots and lots of like Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, maybe some modern Judaism, and then a lot of the middle is very hard to find represented, especially medieval. So these are as later on I kind of note. I think I put it in a quote by Seth Schwartz, who notes that these become disciplinary habits, not just. So these habits of forgetting in the sense of partitioning that which doesn't matter, or that which doesn't matter to us, with an idea you're always talking about a specific us. So Gretz responds to Christian historians of his time. He's quite dramatic about it, saying that they are lowering Judaism into the grave after 70. And so his response isn't to say, okay, Judaism is continually alive. It's like, well, history is what fell away, and then it comes back in the 19th century. What's striking about this is, as a result, he really replicates Gretz and those who come after him. Also really, they answer a Christian story by replicating the structure of that story. And part of this, I just gave a bunch of examples. You can see it in the 2nd century with Justin Martyr, other kind of early Christians who talk about especially the events of their near past. So, framing what they believe as Christians to be the coming of the Messiah. So the coming of the Messiah, you would, instead of framing that as being a moment in the triumph of Israel over foreign nations, which one would expect from many prophecies or so forth, they have this kind of reversal of saying, Jews are proved incorrect, according to Justin, by the destruction of the temple, and especially by the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So in here you have this real sharp periodization. Jewish history ends. And that's even clearer as in actually Augustine, but also in Eusebius, who come during the Christianization of the Roman Empire and really say, these like events in history prove that Jews are outside of history and Jewish history has ended. So there's this kind of interesting way where you see this interplay in the past, in each case kind of framing, the Second Temple period in a different way. So in the Second Temple period, in this case, within early and late antique Christian traditions, it becomes the possession of Christians, not Jews. And then, on the contrary, you also have a kind of, the converse happening, where much of those traditions are being preserved forwards by Jews. I don't think this is a wholly symmetrical story, but it's at least a case in which when we think about questions of periodization, we can see each of them treating this period differently. I'll just talk about one more thing, and then I'll pass, I'll pass so we can kind of have a discussion. I wasn't looking at the time. The question about whether the depiction, this is actually true, of rabbinic literature is really an open question. I think it is not, actually. It is, not particularly true of, I always find striking, everyone assumes that they know that Josephus is writing history. Josephus, when he depicts himself as writing history, he's not depicting himself in a tradition of history at all. In fact, he denigrates history. Like he uses Thucydidean terms, like the idea he's writing very like akropos, like accurately. But then he also says, Thucydides doesn't do it. What does Thucydides know? And so, within the passages, particularly, in Contra Appionum, when he's talking about, literary production, he doesn't depict himself as extending an earlier tradition of history writing. He depicts himself as extending a tradition, barbarian, by the in this Greek language, Greek terminology, traditions of ancient barbarian nations, Egyptians and Babylonians, who have these like accurate record keeping, and the thing that's accurate about them is that they're priestly. They're vouchsafed by priestly succession. So he's not saying, we have like this long tradition of history writing. Which means that when we look at the loss of Josephus and say, look, there's a loss of a long tradition of history writing, we're doing it not reading Josephus. We're using Josephus, not reading him in that way, which a lot of people use Josephus and not reading him that way, including Eusebius. So, but it's kind of this reminder that from that perspective, that's not what happens. So that's his presentation. He's thinking, he doesn't present himself as, history versus non-history. Those of you who, anybody's familiar with like Greek and Latin history, history writing changes at different times. There's, focus on the near past, far past. There's like large gaps in terms of what people cover of the recent past in times where they're more interested in the far past. So seen from that perspective, we think about rabbinic literature, its interest in the distant past. It's basically like the second sophistic. So it's not an unusual thing to be doing at that time. It's actually quite ordinary. Although people get a bit more. And then the other case is just, we find, looking back at this perspective, this, and this is going to the last page, this real sense that there is a, from within the rabbinic literature, you find developments of new genres, and history writing is not the only one that drops out as a result. We don't find astronomical treatises, So we have something that's going on that's a bit more complicated that has to do with a shift in textualization, which is part of what teaching and textualization. And that's part of what I'll talk about tomorrow, but just to note that we have, certain modern narratives kind of lead us not to see things about the past, or even the past as it was seen in the past, in part because, signaling out something, like just taking the idea of history out and looking at it by itself, can be misleading. And we see why it's important, within a 19th century and 20th century context, because it becomes a way of talking about the origins of a field, modern Jewish history. But when we try to say, what is it, that antiquity is like being made to do work there, that is not taking seriously actually antiquity. I have a bunch of concerns about this in general. I also just kind of put on some other sources right at the end, just to say that one good example of this that you also see is that the kind of interest in post at 70 destruction of the temple as being something really lost or broke up, or the idea that history is lost then or changes, is probably something we see it's probably in the Middle Ages we see it take form. Prior to this, and then Chaim Milikowski has done a great job kind of mapping this, is that you really find instead this idea of there being, there could be a succession of empires, so kind of in the pattern of Daniel is the pattern we find. But that any real break, if you're going to talk about a rupture, is exile, not Roman destruction of the temple. So, actually, I probably talked too long.
Perfect.
Okay. So I put a bunch of these sources on because if not knowing what people might want to think is interesting or curious about this, but this is just kind of an example of, I think the type of thing that I'm trying to do in this book, which is, part of it is actually to open a different conversation about what happens when we look at questions about rupture, but not to say that the questions of rupture are oh, that's what really happened, but rather to say, I think part of the challenges of our present, and especially in to be able to think about history writing as something that can be multivocal, and really think about, not signaling out a specific telos or but being able to say, we have different accounts of history that themselves change, that, the past is partial, fragmentary, and so forth, is itself, we see it in the past, and it also kind of opens up different ways for us to also think about ourselves as historians. And especially to think about the choices we make, and then every choice is going to omit, but be more sensitive to what that means, and also thinking that in that way we're participating in a kind of creative encounter with the past or conversation with the past, in which we're not just those who recover, we're also those who create. That's the kind of thing that I'm trying to do. I don't know if I'm successful at it, but having thrown all that stuff at you, I'll just turn back to Kate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I have so many. I'm very excited about this project or this book for a number of reasons. And before maybe opening up to a broader discussion, as we talked about earlier, festivals actually become really important in remembering histories. And I agree with you. The rabbis are very interested in it, and actually, especially in the Babylonian Talmud, they actually provide a lot more intricate details of Roman history than sometimes the Palestinian Talmud does. So to think about, are we looking for history, or accurate history, whatever that might mean, only in certain texts that we might think? Are we trying to find Rome where we think Rome might be, and not looking for it where we don't think it should be, or it's rabbinic imagination? I think it ends up meaning that we are really end up divorcing texts from the actual authors that write them. So I'm very excited about this.
If I could say something about because I think the festivals is it's also a good example of how when we look at the kind of 19th century settings in which became, Western disciplines of history initially took form, you really have this looking back to kind of certain ancient precedents. And within the Jewish studies context, it's all Josephus, which is kind of funny because he's such an idiosyncratic man. But you have this case somehow we're recovering this. But I think part of what happens in the process, and sometimes also in ways that don't do justice to the complexity of the Greek and Latin historiographical tradition, is also this notion of diminishing other ways of preserving the past, where other ways of preserving the past are assumed to be imaginative, and history writing is assumed to be just record.
Yes.
But even if you look at Josephus, he's not. That's not. He sees this idea that you have lists of priestly genealogies kept in the temple. That's for him accuracy.
Yeah.
Whereas like the story somebody tells, the story like Thucydides tells, it's like that's just fanciful. So it's a kind of interesting example where you also have the question of memory making means that the transmission of the Second Temple materials, often happens in unexpected ways, and ritual and especially festal remembrance, and the setting for that. It kind of makes sense as a setting that you would find things transmitted over long periods of time, even if it means that that which you memorialize also means there are other events you don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I think Josephus is one of the reasons we think of Alexander as watershed, because of his in Jewish studies in particular, with this idea of Alexander, sacrificing at the temple, and also of course bringing on other, fields as divisions of history. But yeah, there's an idea that history has to look a particular way, and other genres don't. Not even genres. Other types of histories just don't count. Yeah. So I have obviously a lot more to say, but I want to open it up to everyone in the room, especially our graduate students. So if it's okay. If you guys have comments, I think it would be great to introduce yourself, who you are, very quickly what you do, so that we can interact with one another.
Hey, I'm Ethan. I do Iranian studies.
Oh, perfect.
Also
Great.
dip into the Semitic world. I'm interested in viewing Josephus maybe as an aberration to the Jewish way of conceptualizing the past, and I think maybe Berossus is like a good counterexample. For folks who don't know, he's a Babylonian who also did this thing of, going into the Greek style of telling history, and of course it was very unpopular because the Greeks didn't care, and the Babylonians also didn't care about this style.
But it got preserved.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's like to a modern Western audience, we see these things as finally some good concrete history, but clearly to the people at the time, maybe it wasn't received as well. And I don't know if I really have a question, just rather on the issue of prioritizing the Greek way of doing history versus how other people conceptualize the past.
No, I think Berossus is an interesting interlocutor, because it's, Josephus. I always find it ironic that when Josephus is held up like that, that's not what he tells us. He actually speaks, his point, especially against Appian, is closer to the point that you just made, where it's like, someone like Berossus maybe kind of has to package this material. I'm in that case for Seleucids, but that's not, what it is to really transmit the past. Whereas the King list, for instance, for both Berossus and for Josephus, that would be the kind of real preservation of the past. The kind of the chain of scribes, the chain of priests, that's really what it means to preserve the past. The kind of archival knowledge of that which is preserved by Near Eastern scribes or priests in settings that's not necessarily accessible to the public. Versus, Greek history writing is depicted as, new. It's newfangled. It's it disagrees with itself. Josephus is actually, I find it, this is part of the irony of it, because he's really quite harsh about it. There's too much of it, that you don't have this kind of centralized place. It's not temple-based. It doesn't have a case. You have a place. It's being transmitted, a school. All these people are just writing whatever they want to. I do think Berossus as a precedent is interesting, because you do have this chain of Greek Jewish authors that we know primarily through Alexander Polyhistor, who's quoted in the ninth book of Eusebius's Preparatio, as well as by Clement. Berossus comes down through Syncolus, through the chronographical tradition. So you do have this case where we have these other materials closer to Berossus, where Jews are writing in narrative styles like history. But, Demetrius is one of them, writing in the 3rd century BCE. He does so really he's interested in getting the numbers right. basically taking, kind of biblical accounts where like that, the numbers don't quite add up, and just trying to like figure, Artophonus is doing something else altogether, trying to tell like, histories of origins. So we have a couple examples from closer to the time of Berosus, some of which might respond to him, or to Manetho, who's also, his younger contemporary in Egypt. But I think the interesting thing about Josephus is both idiosyncratic, and he names himself as such. Like, he's not saying, I'm like at the culmination of a tradition of biblical history, which is what everybody else on this page says about him. He doesn't say that. That's exactly the point. And as one of the few locales in North America where you can actually study like a whole breadth of Iranian history. I mean, that's also this case. Like, what do we decide is and isn't important to our present? And so much of it, with respect to also the history of ancient Judaism, is just to assume, it starts with Alexander. So that partitioning is also partitioning that like forgets a lot. It's like, why are these stuff in Aramaic? Who knows? It is a kind of case too. It's like that those the choices of story also affect the choices of discipline in ways that can actually be quite striking. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Brian. I'm for the Revival and Second Period. Yeah, I'm also really interested in the Josephus thing. I mean, something's very for one thing, I'm struck by the truth of what you're saying here. I was recently reading through Herodotus, and just noticed, he's very, very dependent on oral history.
Yeah.
Right? Saying, I talked to these people about this. I talk to these people, but I don't believe them, or whatever. And there's a kind of real contrast there. With this quote from Josephus, he seems to be talking about the tradition of history writing that we might find in like Hebrew instead of the Bible, right? So like, I would imagine he's thinking of the kinds of records and record keeping that are preserved in like Kings and Chronicles and so forth. Do you think that he would make a distinction between what he's doing as a historian and maybe what those books are doing?
Yeah, I think he does. I think sometimes he's talking about two things in this passage, and it's a really fascinating passage. So part of it, he seems to be suggesting that within the temple there are kept genealogical records, and I don't think he's only talking about what we would now call biblical materials. Because when he makes the argument, he makes the argument, there's a continuity of priestly genealogies, because it's important, because that's what keeps your texts. But it also relates to marriage practices. And so he gives the example of himself. Oh, for instance, when I got married, I could go check the genealogies. And this is really important to him, that even when the temple's destroyed, the priestly genealogies continue. And this is a way of kind of vouchsafing knowledge. He then uses that to say, oh, this is how we know that these other records, that which, pretty much what we call biblical literature, and he like goes through them. Like, we know, that's how we know how we know it's trustworthy transmission. And then when he puts himself in this passage, he doesn't put himself in this fashion. And he's using these kind of languages he often uses this language of kind of like what we would often translate out as translation language. So he sees himself as somehow, and this is actually why I think the Berosus is a good example. He's like transferring it from one place to another. He says he's doing a great job. Sorry, but and it's clear that he's saying it in part because other people are saying he's not doing a great job. But he does see himself as he's not extending. And he's not the only, and especially at the beginning of the Jewish War, he's clearly not the only one doing it. So there's some other processing that's going on. But it is actually quite interesting to see in that moment, like how he's presenting himself in that way. And one of the other things I would just note about Herodotus. It is interesting, like with regard to Herodotus, you do have kind of eyewitness, kind of notions of eyewitness. I saw it, I heard it. Kind of also, and Ian Moyer is doing a project about how you also have some types of references within his writing and also, later Egyptian materials, including Ptolemaic materials, where there's that kind of like remembrance is often cited, meaning cited with an S. Like there are places, kind of locations and kind of temple courtyards or so forth that seem to be really closely linked to tellings of memories of the past. That you see at least some side echo of sometimes in Herodotus, where he seems to have at least some like back echo of a native informant of some way. But it's also this case, it's like, there's also this notion, Josephus really links to the temple. But, here too you have some notion the location matters. They're like places where people remember things. And I always think about, the corollary I think about is like sometimes I visit places and people take me around and they say, oh, this is where such and such used to be. So there's a memory of a place that used to stand somewhere that's being conveyed to a person walking through a place with like no real, so the idea of place memory. So I think, in Herodotus we hear like a little bit of it in the background. And then here too, I think there's something important about that our emphasis also on history is kind of history as genre, like leads us to miss. So.
Actually, since you talked about Josephus and his idea of the temple, I keep like returning to this idea of how important the destruction of the temple was to Roman propaganda at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and thinking about, how much can we see the emphasis on the temple in Josephus's writing as something that the empire wanted him to do. Yeah. Of course it's important, but why does Vespasian and Titus and Domitian, why is it there? Because they're building into the landscape, the destruction into the landscape of Rome, and they're doing this to forget Nero and the other Julio-Claudians. So it's like, in the process of remembering the temple, of remembering a Jewish thing, he gets to eliminate a Roman emperor that started the whole thing. Yeah. It's like a competitive. It's a manipulation of both histories. They are intertwined.
Yeah, I think for Josephus, Josephus. Yeah, Josephus is Flavius Josephus. Yeah. So he is a Flavian author in a real sense. And I think we see that kind of desire to have that really be, to dramatize the First Jewish War as being an actual triumph, which you wouldn't necessarily think that should, and they don't really have anything else.
Yeah.
So I think you see that, and then for him, he uses that power of the eyewitness, like he was there, he was walking on the walls. Like the times where Josephus sometimes describes himself in the third person. So I was finding it a little funny. It's like, and then Josephus magnificently called out in his persuasive voice. I feel like I should, anyway, we never have the audacity to do that in the present. But, so he gains authority from that as a historian. And, at the beginning of the Jewish War, you see that there are other people who are writing. So he's not and then in his life, he has to say, oh, actually, I am a great historian of this. And, I was there.
Yeah.
So I think for him, it becomes this, like
an authenticating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where whether or not he thinks of it as being like a watershed, a break in history, like we actually, that's harder to tell. Mm-hmm. That's where he ends his history, but that's also where he was, paid to end his history. So it becomes very tricky to know what that was, and then it's very hard to see it. Part of the reason I put the sources from Justin and Eusebius and Augustine on is Josephus becomes so important for a particular Christian framing of Jewish history, where at the one case, Jewish history prior to 70 is something that Christians should transmit and do transmit, including in a much broader sense than comes down to us, at least within Rabbinic Judaism. And on the other hand, that's all predicated on the idea there's a moment it stops. So 70 is really taken to be this just break So anything before then is fine, or even if it is, written after, but says it's written before, but it's really predicated on that breakage, and it comes to mean something so significantly. I mean, especially for Eusebius and so forth, late antique, so at the Christianization of the Roman Empire, that it's hard for us to see before, like what did Josephus mean, versus how he was quoted and how he was used.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Alex. I study Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Judaism as well.
Yay!
You mentioned before in the beginning talking
Yeah.
about you're dealing with memory studies and critiquing memory, the idea of memory failure. You also mentioned like there's an assumption of lost traditions being suppressed traditions.
Yeah.
So would you say there are examples where maybe we need to think of a lost tradition another way, or is it that forgetting is more neutral or a more positive term?
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. I think there are memory failures, like people forget things, but it's just to say that doesn't mean that everything that's dropped out is just a failure of remembering. I feel like, so this is to say that, I suppose it's for instance, like if I forgot my husband's birthday, I said, oh, it's an accident. Or like my son's birthday, like that wouldn't get me off the hook. So there's a sense of, you remember what you attend to. So that's a kind of one case of example where failure is like it's not necessarily, it's a way of dismissing a kind of forgetting without looking like a bit more closely at what it would entail. So what I do in practice, or at least try to do, is make this kind of taxonomy of the different ways that materials are dropped out of cultural transmission. And some of them have to do with like when I talk about writtenness and oral transmission, it has to do with like the forms in which things are transmitted. Periodization, like at what point do you start? And then what can be relegated to forgetting? Or also the notion of kind of an overwriting. Or the kind of notion of a focus on one thing to the idea that everything else kind of gets blurred around it. So that's at least what I'm trying to do. I mean, I may not be successful. I mean, just a memory failure is the idea of forgetfulness as memory failure is itself productive. It's just that's what I'm not talking about. And also, I personally, there may be examples of suppression, but we don't really see a lot of them in antiquity. Meaning suppression of text. This used to be the most, since, I've written about this elsewhere in relation to like early modern reception of apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. So those early traditions often took form. The early material at times where apocrypha and pseudepigrapha were collected, were often collected in context, actually almost immediately in contexts that were also charged with modern concerns about forgery and censorship. So you often have this case of like, John Toland, for instance, says, Athanasius suppressed all these other materials, and that's why the Book of Enoch doesn't survive, and that in a modern context, often those suppression narratives seem very compelling, censorship. It's like, but some of them, at least I argue, that kind of that conception is retrospectively a print concept, a world of print. We actually see it as a world of print, and you can trace the kind of history of these stories as being around anxieties, advent of printing anxieties about limiting and cordoning off and authenticating, as well as about too much knowledge, which is not the situation we have in antiquity. We don't have this same kind of materials going on. So at least, and that on the one hand. On the other hand, one of the things that we see within ancient traditions, actually best known in terms of classics and traditions about what later come to be called damnatio memoriae, is this concept that most of the times when you're trying to mark somebody as forgotten, you do it in a way so you can see they're forgotten. So you're not really marking them as you're marking them as forgotten. you're like marking them out. So it's like the kind of the contemporary example is like the cancel culture example where somebody's canceled and then goes on like a talk show the next day. It's like, I am canceled, but I mean, so too with many of these traditions we see in antiquity. And like Joseph Howley for Roman books, book burning has noted this, that it's not to destroy the book, it's to proclaim the book as being destroyed. So it's like a much more complicated, it's complicated today even, but especially in antiquity. I think a lot of these, so when I'm trying to do, and again, I'm not sure I'll be successful, you can tell me, but is also to say like some of these things are kind of invitations to look at elements of kind of cultural reception, dynamics of culture making, and kind of cultural creativity that because we really want things to be preserved, that we sometimes forget to look at. And that can be kind of neglected as a result, but kind of fill in a richer picture of like what we know. I don't know if that helps, yeah.
That was wonderful. So I really look forward to this book. I'm excited about Thursday was like too. There's so many questions and things to talk about. But
I chose writing, so you could also correct me on several things of that. No, I'm serious. I thought, I was like, this is a person I want to hear from, so.
But let me give you like one like concrete example to get your reaction to of things that are forgotten or marginalized. I'm thinking of Pirkei Avot. Yeah. And one of the things that has always struck me about Pirkei Avot is that, well, first of all, they don't have Ezra. Yeah. But it's not just they don't have Ezra, there are no priests.
Yeah. There's one.
Right, there's one. But they're basically, they've marked, and they've taken the priests out of the tradition, which is like incredibly striking because from my perspective, Second Temple Judaism is a temple priestly scribal community. Yeah. That's central to the whole thing. So to me there must be, there may be, or maybe there isn't, some dynamic of Sadducees versus Pharisees and different writing cultures and different ideas about like the way the past is properly remembered. Yeah. Liturgy as opposed to history, for example. So I'm actually going to talk about that tomorrow. and I'm glad to hear you say that because like that's what I think too. But I use that as an example of overriding or like the kind of the selectivity. Like you always have to start somewhere. You're not going to include everything. But it's the notion is that the claim to continuity is actually hides hides and also distracts from actually the loss of something that's pretty big. Like I think it's from the standpoint of looking at it from biblical studies, especially from the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's dropped out is it's actually it's incredibly striking. I mean, it's just. Amram Troper wrote a book about Simon the Righteous and the inclusion. There's this where he makes the argument that the inclusion of Simon in that list as the one priest, he kind of like attracts all the priestly traditions so that they can be like really kind of passed down to rabbis, which is a kind of interesting argument where it's this kind of, because otherwise it's very strange. However, it's both strange and it normalizes forward. Like I always find it interesting. It's like, if you want to present on Second Temple materials at AJS, it's like, good luck finding like a section to put it in. So it becomes naturalized. I mean, that's why I think it's kind of interesting. Like after that, it becomes a case of like, oh, obviously you just have like basically, all you're caring about is like Moses to the rabbis, and everything else is like just like, you just have to like get there very quickly as you can. Oh yeah, they're priests. Like let's just keep or whole. I mean, Ezra is a really striking example in that regard. Because of the cases, like it's not so distant from a vote that you have for Ezra, which is making the opposite case. Yeah. So there's something interesting going on, but you can tell me tomorrow if you agree with my read. But I agree. Thursday. So it's a great topic.
Yeah. You can use the awards for SBL too as another example. There's nothing for Second Temple.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, they're kind of
like
whole
New
waves.
Testament, there's Hebrew Bible, and there's creativity in something.
Well, the interesting things, if you look at the AJS, the Association of Jewish Studies, they have 3 sections. You have 2 sections, Bible and Rabbinics,
You often actually have in older materials, you have the biblical period and the Talmudic age. It's like, it's like what comes in between? Like, oh, nothing. Shit.
Yeah.
But now, and I used to be the head of this, is what they call it, history, Jewish history. But it's like, oh, so there's like, you basically have like Bible history, which means like, oh, we need a place to put Josephus. Like, what if someone submits on Josephus, 2 Maccabees? Like, what are we going to do? But there's this real case where it's like interesting. We see these, that's what I mean by actually source 12 is the one where I put Seth Schwartz's comment. I mean, these are become disciplines. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes like completely naturalized. I mean, you can still see it, but it becomes, that's just, or you say, I always think it's so funny. It's like, throughout my career as a person who studied Second Temple Judaism, like every position I had has a different name because there's no place for just a Second Temple Judaism person. It's like, oh, you study, I don't know, New Testament. It's like, well, it's like, you must study. It's like always this. You're kind of like betwixt in between, but at the same time, that this has been in terms of like kind of actual knowledge making and transformation, largely because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This has become like this has been like the most, there's just like incredible amounts of data, like a lot to do. And then the disciplinary structures are still, they've never made space for them.
I mean, this is even the case with Aramaic.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
Aramaic studies,
Yeah.
like the panel at SBL has mostly been about Targum, because Aramaic has been relegated to particular eras and of particular groups. And it's frustrating. Sorry? Orphanology. Yes. And everyone knows my thoughts on that. Yeah.
That's interesting. Oh, sorry.
I'm Adam. I do a Hebrew Bible and I also do some Egyptology.
Nice.
I'm really interested to go back to the idea of like this taxonomy you're developing for thinking through different types of forgetting. I'm curious how you develop like criteria for thinking through what each type of memory forgetting might look like, especially in these cases where they're not clearly marked forgetting. I mean, you think like the suppression campaign after the Amarna period, like Akhenaten gets completely obliterated from the record, and it's very clearly marked that that's why they do it. But then you look at other things like it seems like the Hebrew Bible has both in Kings and Chronicles in different ways kind of forgotten that Taharka is the king that sent accurate packing when he had besieged Jerusalem. So but it's subtle, like it's not clearly marked in any way. So how do you think like about applying the taxonomy in kind of ambiguous cases?
See, I'm lucky to be at the beginning of a project. So I use my taxonomy kind of loosely. So I don't think like, oh, I have to, I personally, I'm not a big fan of thinking of classification as explanation. And I also feel like, especially the study of Second Temple Judaism has done that a little too much, saying like, if we only knew the genre of this text, we would understand it. I don't know if that's the case. But that said, part of what I'm doing in my list is also trying to bring in kind of interlocutors. So I collect different theorists of different sorts that have spoken to this from different directions that actually sometimes include like things like Borges. I mean, you have to go wide in order to find things. Umberto Eco, as well as someone like Eviato Zerubbabel. So I'm pretty loose about my taxonomies. The reason I'm loose about them is for me the spirit is to try to capture something that's not passive loss and something that's not active suppression. Like those two things are pretty easy to see. But like what comes in between and how do we kind of think about them and begin to kind of develop a vocabulary to think about them. And I also think, for what it's worth, I'm using a very particular example, and I'm sure people use a different example will come up with a different taxonomy, but that's kind of part of the spirit. Like that's the hope. Since the 1980s and the kind of real development, disciplinary development of memory studies and concepts of, obviously ideas came before, but meaning the idea that this is an interdisciplinary field. You have like a lot of different elements in which those are, and kind of subcategories in which those are studied. I feel for this type of topic we don't have them. So that's at least my, and then the hope is
once you get kind of one set, like, oh, here's some sets, here's some things that are both in conversation with, other types of theorists, things that come out of this particular material, that then people could take it elsewhere and be like, okay, this doesn't fit, but oh, here's something else. Like, that's kind of the hope. So that's your job. That's my short to do. Yeah. But those are both great examples, I was thinking, like, Antiochus 3 is not in 1 and 2 Maccabees.
Yeah, no.
You just like, it's incredibly important.
Yeah.
You have these, like, figures who, looking backwards, you would say, why is it,
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you. Great lecture, and you left me with more questions, with more questions than I started with. But as a film historian, I always there's Rashomon, the Rashomon, where you can't really get the truth, because everyone, no matter who you're writing, whether you're talking propaganda or this, nobody can get at that element. I'm wondering whether, when you talk about forgetting, I was thinking of Milan Kundera, who wrote, forgetting is an essential part of being a human, because you literally go insane if you remembered everything. I mean, you need to forget. So I'm wondering also about whether, when you talk about Christian memory and Jewish memory, that they're all being, that there is no possible. I mean, and I'm wondering whether you can bring in other say a geologist to describe, or like there's a great filmmaker, Peter Watkins, who actually gets people who are in the same job. Like if you're going to talk about nature, you find a baker, have him look into the baking, and then somehow you can get that truth. But is there any, what I'm asking is can you ever get to the truth, or any sort of truth?
Well, so I think that's a fantastic question. I think so. For my first chapter of this book actually talks about kind of different disciplines, and one of the things I actually note is the degree which we have in fiction and film are probably the places, and poetry are the places where these topics have been most richly explored. And then the kind of irony is in a lot of the discipline of history, it's like we at least have the illusion that we want to be complete. And often, sometimes we have the illusion that we are being complete, where at the same time, we know that first of all, neurologically, completeness would drive you crazy. Really, in the literal sense, people have like a kind of, there's a, neurologists say, forgetting is an important part of a healthy mnemonic system. And it's just like the way the system works, and that's partially what's important about it. And then we also have a kind of experience sense that that's true. I think for me, I think part of what this did for me is to say, that it's and this is another one of my chapters, are kind of types of forgetting. One of the types of forgetting is the illusion of totality. So to say, like if I were to tell a story about how I experienced something and I said, oh, that one is true. This is like the complete story. That is actually an act of erasure. And the kind of example that I always think about is there's once when I was presenting this work where somebody said, well, I think for the history of the Jews, we pretty much have everything that's important. This was actually a story, I'm not going to name it. But I have key here, I'm going to name him. And, another historian, female, said, you can actually say that despite the fact that we basically know nothing about women in this entire period. The period we have to be talking about. And everybody was quiet. But that's the notion is that, I think part of what historians, academic historians, tend to have a kind of part of our unfortunate inheritance from our Enlightenment, the founders of kind of academic history writing, Enlightenment and after, is this notion that somehow what we're saying is both certain static and complete. And that's what makes it important. Also objective. Whereas actually, there's no disembodied objectivity. A partial story is just as compelling. There's nothing about it that makes it less true. So truth that is not the kind of completeness was the only truth that truth, but completeness isn't the only truth. So the partial story, the fragment, the perspective, the one perspective. Because I was thinking as I lay dying is another example of that. So I just want to say one more thing,
So I taught this seminar, but the last seminar I taught at NYU was about memory and forgetting, going through kind of theoretical materials. And the best part about it is I actually had the filmmakers. And one of so I had people could submit documentaries or kind of other films as being part of it, they could submit as their final feedback. And one of the person who did a documentary done this kind of documentary about this man who had fought in Vietnam. He came back to the United States, and then he had was going through these boxes of things that he had from there, and then also kind of had gone back to kind of charting some of his journey, as well as a series of art pieces that he had made to kind of mediate his memories. A fascinating piece. Everyone was like, oh, this is a very great piece about memory and forgetting. And then, when people at the end, when she showed it, she then sat down and then she told us that she cut out. So it was incredibly good. As a peer, it was incredibly powerful. Because in a sense, as much as she had told this man's story, she was like, oh, here's what I have to do that to make it a story. So it's like, I think it's a way in which I think we as historians, or those who are historians, we actually have a lot to learn from that. And the kind of illusion, like, oh no, I'm telling facts as it really is. You're just like telling a story about it. So that's a dangerous illusion that is itself a motive.
Well, there's a great scene in a good argument, 2 or 3 things I know about her. But anyway, she has a woman who's crying, and she says, "You can see my tears, but you can never understand why. And I can try to explain, but it doesn't matter. You can never explain." And I think that's the same with the photograph, or even when we were talking the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can look at the interpretation, but you can never, at best, you can get a format and bring our own. So I like to show film to say this is like an interpretation. I used to, when I taught film history, I was the Monty Python and the Life of Brian and the Holy Grail. Historical and people go, that's not history. And I go, well, in a way, it's kind of taking our time and putting it there.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, good.
Yeah, I'm Tyler. I also do Hebrew Bible and Kingdom and period Judaism, and I really am fascinated.
Forgetting. We're in a hurry to get to sorry.
I'm really interested in the concept of active forgetting, but in particular, I guess in the distinction between self-inflicted active forgetting and then active forgetting imposed upon a group. So I don't know that I have a fully formed question around it, but just maybe in terms of how those are differentiated in the way we see history shapes. Is the wrong way to phrase that, but something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like prior to doing my first chapter, and again, I don't know if this is, I was trying to think of the categories interesting because it kind of challenges us to think beyond passivity and activity in that way. But one of the main one of the main conversation partners I have is with regard to histories of slavery and just the Middle Passage. Because it's first of all, you have these historians like Harvard who do a beautiful job of really thinking about the problem of, on the one hand, individuals who either try to forget trauma, can't forget, or also at the same time you have institutions that in the archive, that which is preserved in writing, is so shaped by the very institutions that are enslaving people that they erase the voices of the people even when they say that they're prisoners. And so this is one of the main kind of pieces in my first chapter is that you have this, really, and this is part of the reason why we do this project is the amount of really kind of serious, sophisticated, and also really kind of ethically challenging work that says, our histories that claim to preserve are also often erasing the people that claim to preserve, and also erasing a whole set of other people by saying who is the topic of history. these examples, you know, the examples of Jewish history are they're less, they're not of the same sort, but at the same time, when you see the kind of Christian erasure of post-Christian Judaism, that has a long unpleasant history. So it's like, it has ethical consequences to say, you know, these only matter in terms of what it preserves pre-Christian past, which is what Augustine says. That opens up, it opens up a lot of things in that regard. So I think there's a case in which, you know, we have, those are the examples you really see both this side. So there's a lot of kind of, those who study ancient Judaism can't always recover all of those pieces. But we do know, for instance, and we don't know about meaning, one of the things that does happen into late antiquity is we used to have, you know, evidence of Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean, and that evidence begins to disappear. So you have some sense in which Christian memory making about Jews is also curtailing Jewish existence under Christian empire. So I think there's like some, it's an important, I think of it as a generative tension to think about it. I don't think there's like, as you can tell, my scholarship in general is not very oriented towards people who like tidy solutions. And this is definitely a case where it's like, yeah, I'm not going to be like, there's not going to be a tidy solution here. But hopefully there are things to think about, you know. But that's definitely like a very striking, and also like where, you know, when we think of ourselves as historians, I mean, there's something that comes with that story.
In mid-20th century, we got this big trove of documents from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and for decades, access to that information was strictly controlled. Was there attempts at censorship and or suppression and or now we feel that this is all the stories that we know as best we can, or is there an attempt to let us forget some of that information?
That's a good question. Yeah, the way in which it was first published out was not. It definitely was a case initially where you had the whole story of the way that they were sold, or this is a story, but they definitely were initially sorted out so that, you know, primarily Christians followed this material, with consequences that, you know, leadership and others have discussed and pushed back upon, and has so there's definitely so that situation did improve. Part of what made it more democratized, I would say, is is kind of the shift of technology to digitalization. So it's been easier for more people from more different places to go to things. This partially, however, is why, and sometimes when I talk about the, you know, discoveries in C-Script, they go, oh, it's like, it's been like 70 years or whatever. That's part of what made it a slow process, though. And has also meant that it's taken a while to kind of get different perspectives on different things. I don't think we find any kind of, you know, suppression or censorship. The part that everybody was too disorganized to censor material, honestly. But what we do find is patterns of knowledge making whereby the things that seem to speak to, especially the questions that Christian scholars have, things that were like Jesus shaped, you know, were studied first and most excitedly. Things like astronomical material, you know, so, oh look, it's like, looks like Mesopotamian astronomy. That was like pretty late down the line. So you have, you have much, I mean, I'm getting a kind of more subtle versions. I think another factor, which is kind of also complicated, is forgery. There's a more, you know, recently we have forgeries that do tend to be constructed to try to speak to things people are interested in, but as a result, it also kind of messes up the conversation. So it's not like you can say, oh, we found everything, we're done. But at the same time, I don't think you have an active say,
active censorship and at this point, versus withholding information.
You just alluded to this, but I was curious, without pressing you for a concrete static or a technically true answer, you bring up the astronomical book, and I'm curious what kind of forgetting was, like the book took all out of tradition, or the traditions of like astronomical books felt like out of Jewish tradition.
That's a good question. I actually don't answer that. I mean, it's good. I mean, it doesn't fall out. It doesn't fall out of tradition because it's preserved, continuous preserved in Ethiopian. And Ethiopian Computist traditions kind of built on this. But it does suggest that some of those astronomical traditions that we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls are very closely linked to certain things about certain calendars. That it's not that calendrical controversies don't cease; they just change. So you don't have like people really invested in this appears over time. So I think if that's kind of, what my guess would be. It is interesting though. It is a kind of, and it was, I mean, even when those materials were first found, Michael Stone, for instance, was just like, wow, look at this. So kind of this, noting the surprise. We actually didn't know this was here. And it took a while, also because you had to have, first like, Northern Ireland was like, oh, it's just like, this is catastrophic. It's like, oh, because of like, you have this process by which more research that was across fields kind of helped to say, this did make sense in its time, but again, that really does sharpen the question. At what point does that material either become, doesn't have the prestige it had earlier, or it's like too linked to certain calendars that didn't end up having community supporting them. I should probably do that. That's good. This is why I'm here. Thank you so much. Sure.
Well, I mean, one more question of what profound intentional forgetting, and you must have thought about this.
No.
But I'm thinking about, especially in the historical genre, the books of Kings and Chronicles. I mean, Chronicles intentionally writes out Israel. I mean, it's really an interesting case of, and yet, that people will sometimes say, oh, yeah, but it assumes they know Israel, because sometimes you can't really read the book without knowing the part that's elided from history. And occasionally you even have to include parts of it, but as a massive act of intentionally forgetting, it's really interesting. I would say that there are political reasons for it, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on that particular act of forgetting.
Yeah, I focus on the Second Temple period forward. However, there's a way in which it's like things I do are conversations with. Well, no, I didn't. What Chronicles is really going to be the death.
Well, that's a question you didn't say. Alexander.
I'm actually talking about the Second Temple period, so I'm talking about it in memory. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm talking about what's remembered. And at the end of the book, I actually question that partitioning, saying that this is itself, And one of the main things it does in terms of that, that's the part about archival amnesia, is that which comes to be within the canon, comes to be partitioned off. And it's also assumed to be regular in a way, not regular, harmonized. They're harmonized ways of reading where those that's like, just like, it's like, you kind of assume, like, oh, well, they couldn't do it. Or like, yes, they could. So I'm happy to leave that to other people to do. But it is, I will say, on the one hand, I feel like, some of my categories of cultural amnesia come from, or at least in conversation with how Mark Smith has dealt with some of that material. But I think the question of Chronicles is actually a question that, at the end of the day, probably people that study Second Temple Judaism and people that study biblical materials that have tended to just kind co-taught this course on the 3rd century BCE with my publicist colleague, who was at NYU, was Andrea Feldman, who's going to Princeton, and we taught this course and just like, let's just go through everything we have, kind of related to Jews and Judaism in the 3rd century BCE. But I wanted to kind of capture what that time was, so I don't know why I did this, but I decided we should do it backwards. So starting with the, basically the Maccabean revolt materials, and then working backwards, and just seeing like, oh, what does it look like if we don't assume like we're all on the way to the Maccabean revolt, so we're just like in a hurry to get there. And the interesting thing is we actually ended with which made me think like I should have included it in this book, and I didn't, but it's also in part it's something that somebody memorized. It's really something someone should do, because there are a lot of ways where, for instance, like First and Chronicles and Disciplinary Archival actually have kind of some interesting overlaps that I don't know if anybody's really talked about, because the people who study them are completely different. Even though we actually, and then we were just talking about Esther, and you have these materials where people, because of Martin Hengrove, people have done that more in terms of Kohelet, thinking like, okay, this should be part of that same story. But in practice, when people are trained in Second Temple Judaism, it's like, oh, we don't, it's like, oh, there are enough publicists doing the Bible things, so we don't do that. And then you're like, oh, maybe that's not what we do. So.